I'm Alan Berube from Brookings. First thing I want to say is it's good to be back here at the Federal Reserve with David, where after a very long gestation period, we gave birth to the Concentrated Poverty Report in December. The delivery was pleasurable. Everything leading up to that was a little more difficult, so I have good memories about being here with David. One note I'd offer at the beginning, I didn't know about this alternate title that the book had, Nowhere to March. I think David maybe means that as a critique, but as a Washingtonian, I like the idea of people having nowhere to march, because when they do march, sometimes they march right across my front lawn. So I'm actually not going to talk about the subject of this book specifically today, at the evolution of affordable housing policy and practice, because I'm not really an expert in that, and you have three experts up here in that subject. But instead about a subject I know a lot more about. This is a variant of the old Washington rule that you don't answer the question that you were asked, but instead answer the question that you wish you were asked. So I'm going to talk about something I know a lot about, but I think David's book reveals a lot of lessons about that subject and demonstrates the power of his analysis and its broader applicability. So this is about another network that I'm sort of close to in my work. It's a little bit more recent in vintage. So for lack of a better term, because I've never really had to term it like David did with his network, I'll call this the decentralized tax network. And the impetus for the creation of this network was a small tax credit passed in 1975 that's sort of like the low-income housing tax credit at the time of its inception, was intended to offset losses that taxpayers were going to receive due to a change somewhere else in the system. And in this case, it was the increase in the payroll tax that workers were going to suffer at the federal level, especially low-income workers. And this credit became the Earned Income Tax Credit. And its real value today is at least 10 times what it was 35 years ago, thanks to successive expansions over several Congresses, several administrations, both Republican and Democratic. And those expansions, well, the first thing that they did was greatly reduce the tax burden on low-income working families, the income tax burden at least. But they, secondly, eventually created what is a significant wage subsidy for the working poor today. And it's really the single largest anti-poverty program at the national level for these families. And in doing so, it brought a whole new group of Americans into contact with the tax system, which never really had much of a relationship with taxes or the IRS before. As it did so, a small group of progressive foundations and national organizations, beginning in really the late 1980s and more deliberately in the early 1990s, began to put their resources and their efforts into two areas, one of which was continuing expansions of the EITC at the federal level, and also creating new analogs to the EITC at the state level, where traditionally income taxes have been more regressive. Wisconsin was the first state to enact an EITC in 1986. But beginning in the late 1980s, early 1990s, these foundations and organizations put their efforts behind creating more of these. And the second thing that they did was begin to broaden the outreach around the Earned Income Tax Credit to ensure that eligible families were filing taxes and claiming it. The key organization here in Washington was the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and it played a role in both of these areas. Again, the outreach area and the policy advocacy area. It helped as well to coordinate a growing number of these state-level organizations who are working on tax and fiscal issues, including creating and expanding state EITCs. And today, there are 31 states and state-level organizations that are part of this thing called the State Fiscal Analysis Initiative. And 23 states have a version of the EITC that works very much like the federal one, piggybacks on it. That's up from one state 20 years ago. That's pretty amazing policy change in a short amount of time. And beginning in the late 1990s, in sort of response to what was going on at the federal level and in states, cities and counties began mounting their own outreach campaigns, responding to some evidence that there was significant underparticipation in the credit that left lots of federal aid for working families on the table in Washington that could really promote local well-being, local economic development. So paired with what were greatly expanded free tax preparation services for these low-income filers in order to preserve the value of of credits for those families, which often got siphoned off by commercial tax preparers. This is the EITC, but also this new refundable version of the child credit. National and regional foundations started to put their money behind this as well. These hundreds of campaigns that now exist across the nation. They do about a million tax returns annually, but reach much larger number of taxpayers through their outreach. In some cases, the same community development corporations who are building housing are leaders in this effort as well. And they actually organize themselves today under this umbrella group called the National Community Tax Coalition. They've successfully garnered new federal funds, new local funds to provide these services. They're increasing their collective voice in policy debates at federal and state levels around the future of these credits. So this is a long-winded story, but to get back to where David was, I think this network, this decentralized tax network, at least the delivery portion of it, finds itself at a crossroads today. A less mature network, surely, than what David's describing in his book, but the questions are similar around scale, around sustainability, around the efficiency of the existing model that's been created, and there are really critical policy issues on the near-term horizon. Ellen alluded to the fact that in the next couple of years we're going to have a mammoth tax bill here in Washington that could have some really significant effects on the clients that this decentralized tax network is serving. So what does David's examination of the decentralized housing network suggest about the value and the viability of the decentralized tax network? Three things I'll point to. First is the integration of the private sector and private capital into the decentralized housing network while introducing the sorts of vulnerabilities that I think Ellen's done a very good job of detailing, has clearly strengthened the political support for that network over time, helped to increase its efficiency and its market discipline. The decentralized tax network, I think, benefits from some of this on the policy end because employers, low-wage employers, typically like the EITC over other subsidy mechanisms like the minimum wage and tend to support it and campaigns to expand at the federal level or at the state level. But the delivery end is just beginning to experiment with these sorts of private sector partnerships with big commercial preparers like H&R Block. So I think there are big questions to be resolved for this network still about the revenue model and what role the private sector plays in that revenue model, which, for that matter, is really the largest deliverer of these benefits at the end of the day to these families. H&R Block files about itself files about 25% of low-income returns in America today. So I think finding a more productive way to partner with the private sector is one key question. A second one is the role that greater professionalization and specialization could play in promoting the adaptability and innovation of this network. I serve on the board of something here in D.C. called the Capital Area Asset Building Coalition. It coordinates the outreach and free tax preparation campaign for the EITC in the District of Columbia. But it is geographically bounded right now. There's one in D.C. and there's one in Baltimore. The only difference between them really is their locations. But each is really a tub on its own bottom, doing all of the things that each of them does in their local context. Meanwhile, most poor people in the D.C. region and the Baltimore region live in neither the District of Columbia nor the city of Baltimore, but in our suburbs, and that is not where the services are, frankly. So rather than expand the reach of both of these organizations so that we meet somewhere geographically in the middle, like Howard County, I don't know quite where that would be, but I think we need to think about each playing a more specialized role in these transactions as more organizations in the decentralized housing network, I think, have begun to, and David's pointed out the potential benefits of that. Local knowledge, I think, matters on this to an extent, especially on the policy side, but at some level, 11040 just looks like another. And then third, to become a truly transformative force, I do think this network has to engage in the sort of self-analysis that David recommends for the decentralized housing network in Chapter 6. The same question, I think, faces it that David points out for the housing network. Does the work of that network fit into a larger goal of building economically viable communities? I do think, and I pointed this out to David at points over time, that some elements of the housing network view themselves as delivering units, and that's the end. That is the goal. But I do think the highest performers in that network view it as a platform for achieving broader societal goals around safety, health, access to better jobs and schools, enhanced connections to community. And I think that examples that David pointed out succeed on those fronts. The decentralized tax network, I really do think, has to push itself along those same lines. You can count the returns you prepare pretty easily, but it's better to show how your work lifts incomes, improves financial security and opportunity for low-income families and communities. Finally, on a somewhat unrelated note, I just want to credit David with writing what is a really well-written book. I get lots of policy books across my desk, and I can barely get through one chapter of many of them. I actually read this one cover to cover when I got a manuscript of it. It is so light and readable, and the cover art so appealing, available for only $29.50 on the black table, that when I brought this book home last night, my 2-year-old daughter demanded that we read it. Daddy, read this one. Daddy, read this one. I said, you want to read this or Harry the Dirty Dog? She said, this one, this one. She liked the blurbs on the back, especially, of which I have one, but she didn't like mine. Mine went on a little too long. I think she liked yours a little better, Ellen. So congratulations on a great piece of work, Dave.